I tell you solemnly that I have many times tried to become an insect, but I was not equal even to that. I swear, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness. Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground stands as a counter to Nikolay Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done, which advocates a utopia based on the so-called natural laws of self-interest. Chernyshevsky's vision was rooted in scientism and rationalism, yet Dostoevsky saw in this vision a grave danger. To him, the rationalist ideas behind utilitarianism, socialism, and scientific determinism were gateways to a fatalistic worldview. In Dostoevsky's eyes, this path, if pursued, ultimately leads to nihilism, a belief in nothing, a void of meaning. He saw nihilism not as a philosophical stance, but as a destructive force, particularly hazardous for young minds. For Dostoevsky, the rise of nihilistic thinking risked a profound moral and spiritual decay, a theme he sought to expose through his novels. Yet, Notes from Underground is more than a simple critique. The novella's protagonist, the underground man, serves as an anti-hero who embodies nihilistic traits while paradoxically resisting them. His character is both a nihilist and, in a way, an anti-nihilist, offering a complex portrayal that has fascinated readers and philosophers alike. It's this duality that makes Notes from Underground such a captivating text. It's a work that offers different meanings to each reader, inviting them to uncover new perspectives on life with each read. Through one particular lens, the underground man becomes almost a mirror of the modern mind, a person trapped in overthinking, whose self-awareness, rather than offering clarity, becomes a source of torment. His overconsciousness alienates him from happiness, as he grapples with an inner complexity that resonates with the struggles many face today. So, let's discuss the 5 main points that make the underground man an unhappy person. Alive, but dead within. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unpleasant man. The protagonist was a government officer who despised his job. He continued working there solely because he needed money to eat and cover basic necessities. After the death of a relative, he inherited some wealth, which meant he no longer had to work. He had no friends or close relationships, so he decided to live alone in a small, grimy apartment in St. Petersburg, Russia. Hopelessness consumed him, and he began to take pleasure in the isolation of his underground apartment. He didn't see himself as an honorable person, which brings him to a stage of nihilism where people often fall into depression and believe they are insignificant. The underground man seems to embody this nihilistic mindset. He abandoned his somewhat busy life to wallow in despair, overthinking in his small apartment. He admitted that he had failed to make something of himself, and now felt that he wasn't even worth the life of an insect. To him, he was just a speck in the corner of his room. The individual recognizes that something is wrong with his liver, but refuses to seek medical help, despite knowing it would worsen his condition. While he respects medicine and doctors, his refusal to treat himself stems from a deep, irrational defiance, a form of self-punishment. Although he understands his actions are harmful only to himself, he intentionally lets his illness worsen, symbolizing his internal struggle and the slow decay of his spirit. His refusal to seek treatment reflects his bitterness and self-destructive mindset. The underground man represented a state of profound disillusionment, isolation, and self-destructive introspection that resonates with issues many people face today. Like him, many feel disconnected from the purpose of their work or education, merely going through the motions without any true fulfillment, often driven by economic pressures. With few genuine connections or social support, they retreat into their own underground, whether through social media, isolation, or unhealthy coping mechanisms. Just as the underground man refuses to seek help for his health problems out of spite, some avoid addressing their mental health issues or seeking help due to mistrust, pride, or despair. This self-destructive, nihilistic mindset arises when life feels purposeless or when the world seems indifferent to personal struggles, leaving people to enjoy despair in lonely, introspective spaces. The Underground Man's story serves as a warning against letting cynicism and hopelessness lead to isolation and detachment from life's possibilities, a challenge that remains highly relevant today. Escaping life's struggles. The protagonist always avoids challenges, ultimately making himself miserable. Believing himself to possess a rare, superior intellect, he sees himself as too perceptive and intelligent to engage in the petty struggles and confrontations of everyday life. This sense of superiority becomes a crippling flaw, trapping him in endless overthinking instead of taking any meaningful action. When faced with people he considers beneath him, he fantasizes about asserting his dominance, even wishing to slap them in petty acts of revenge. Yet, he never follows through. His contempt for others, combined with his lack of action, leaves him isolated and embittered as he sees himself as above the very confrontations that could give him purpose. One pivotal moment comes when he forces himself into a farewell party thrown by former schoolmates who have long moved past him socially and emotionally. His presence is uninvited, and when they ultimately dismiss and leave him behind, he seethes with resentment and plots revenge. Yet paralyzed by his own fear and indecision, he does nothing, sinking deeper into frustration and self-loathing. Desperate to soothe his wounded pride, he seeks out Liza, a prostitute, hoping to assert some form of control or significance. But his attempt to connect with her only highlights his emptiness, as he realizes his spiteful self-isolation has robbed him of true connection and fulfillment. He advises Liza to quit prostitution because she is selling his soul instead of his body, and he offers to help her just to feel superior to someone else, driven by his inability to take revenge on his so-called friends. This mirrors the struggles of people today who, fearing failure or discomfort, choose to avoid challenges and remain in their comfort zones. Much like the Underground Man, some convince themselves they're above taking certain risks or engaging in typical pursuits, often viewing themselves as more insightful or complex than others around them. This self-image leads to overthinking rather than action, with endless analysis replacing real effort. They may fantasize about asserting themselves or confronting others, but ultimately shrink from confrontation, believing they're too smart for it. This avoidance, while initially comfortable, leads to a cycle of dissatisfaction and stagnation, as they miss out on personal growth, meaningful relationships, and achievements. Just as the Underground Man felt trapped in bitterness and missed opportunities, modern comfort zone thinking can lead to frustration and self-doubt. Attempts to soothe that discontent by seeking temporary relief, whether through distractions, superficial relationships, or escape activities, only reinforce feelings of inadequacy. This avoidance can create a cycle of misery, where one becomes increasingly disconnected from both self and society. The paralysis of overthinking. The Underground Man is the epitome of someone trapped by their own overthinking, an individual paralyzed by their thoughts rather than motivated by action. He is convinced of his intellectual superiority, believing that his constant analysis makes him more perceptive than those who take action without second-guessing themselves. To him, those who succeed or push forward in life are merely impulsive, naive, or even foolish, because they don't take the time to reflect deeply on every decision. He prides himself on his overconsciousness, his heightened awareness of every detail, every consequence, every nuance. This, he thinks, is the sign of true intelligence, a gift that others lack. But paradoxically, his overthinking becomes his curse, as it robs him of the ability to take any real steps toward change or growth. While he sees his constant mental deliberation as a form of protection, a shield against the world's randomness, it only exacerbates his misery. He admits that this overconsciousness, far from enriching his life, often paralyzes him, making him unable to enjoy simple pleasures or embrace the opportunities in front of him. Instead of savoring life or acting on impulse, he spends his time contemplating and scrutinizing every potential outcome, no matter how small or insignificant. This obsession with avoiding mistakes, driven by a fear of making the wrong choice, means that he never truly lives, he simply exists in a loop of thought. In the face of the world's challenges, the underground man retreats. Rather than confront the uncertainty of the outside world, he secludes himself in a small, cramped apartment, where he feels safe from the overwhelming forces he believes are beyond his control. The world outside is too chaotic, too unpredictable, and he feels powerless in it. His intellect, which he believes sets him apart, only makes him feel more disconnected from others as he watches people around him move forward, seemingly without hesitation or thought. To him, they are foolish for not considering the full scope of their actions. His isolation in his apartment becomes a self-imposed exile, a refuge from a world that doesn't conform to his need for certainty and control. This mindset resonates deeply with a significant part of the modern world, where many choose to remain inactive, paralyzed by overthinking and fear of failure. In an age where information is endless and the pressure to make perfect decisions can feel overwhelming, there is a tendency to analyze every option, every consequence, in search of the right path. This leads to a cycle of paralysis by analysis, where action is avoided because the risk of making a mistake feels too great. Much like the underground man, individuals today may convince themselves that their intellect and their deep thinking set them apart from the foolish masses who act without consideration. Yet like him, they too find themselves trapped in a loop of contemplation, unable to make meaningful decisions or take risks that could lead to personal growth. Self-hate and isolation. It is clear to me now that, owing to my unbounded vanity and to the high standard I set for myself, I often looked at myself with furious discontent, which verged on loathing, and so I inwardly attributed the same feeling to everyone. The underground man is a character consumed by contradictions, particularly when it comes to his feelings toward others. On one hand, he openly admits to hating everyone around him, seeing them as shallow, foolish, or beneath his intellectual superiority. He despises their simplicity, their unexamined lives, and their unquestioning acceptance of the world. Yet in the same breath, he confesses that he cannot truly hate anyone because his conscience constantly intervenes. His heightened self-awareness, his constant overthinking, paralyzes him. He is caught in a mental tug-of-war, torn between his desire to lash out and his inability to act on these impulses due to his conscience, which often leaves him confused and helpless in his treatment of others. This inner conflict becomes one of the core sources of his misery. He admits to wanting to slap many people throughout his life, those who have irritated him, those who have shown arrogance, or simply those who represent what he despises about society. These imagined slaps symbolize his deep desire to assert his perceived superiority and to physically express his frustration. However, every time he considers acting on this impulse, his consciousness holds him back, making him more self-aware of his emotions and actions than he would like to be. In the end, this only exacerbates his sense of impotence and isolation, as he feels powerless to make any meaningful impact on the world around him. His inability to act on his hatred and frustration, combined with the constant self-reflection, drives him deeper into his own misery. This leads him to withdraw further into his small apartment, sinking into nihilism and a sense of futility. His frustration with others and himself culminates in a form of self-destruction as he sabotages any potential for connection or redemption. Intellectual superiority. An intelligent man cannot become anything seriously, and it is only the fool who becomes anything. The underground man's belief in his intellectual superiority goes beyond mere arrogance. It manifests in a profound aversion to taking responsibility for anything. He sees himself as too enlightened and refined to engage in the mundane, tedious tasks that others must deal with. Whether it's in his government job or in his personal life, he avoids responsibility, convinced that his superior intellect places him above the trivialities of everyday existence. To him, acting in ways that normal people do, taking action, facing challenges, or fulfilling responsibilities seems beneath him. He cannot bring himself to do the simple, often routine things that would require him to engage with the world practically, because in his mind, those who do are stupid for not questioning everything the way he does. His intellectual arrogance leads him to reject any form of action that might force him to confront the world or take accountability. As a government officer, for instance, he actively enjoyed irritating people who came to him for help with their applications. He found satisfaction in frustrating them, seeing it as a way to reinforce his superiority. Instead of helping people or fulfilling his duties, he would deliberately act in ways that caused inconvenience or distress, all while reveling in the power his intellect gave him over others. For the underground man, this was a way to assert his dominance, to remind others of his supposed superiority by showing them that their needs and requests were insignificant to him. He refuses to take on any task that could potentially undermine his sense of superiority, because doing so would mean acknowledging the world as it is, a world where people must take responsibility and act in ways he considers beneath him. This attitude leads him to further isolation and frustration, as he avoids the challenges that come with living an active life and refuses to face the consequences of his inaction. Instead of growing and finding meaning through experience, he chooses to wallow in his own intellectualism, which ultimately deepens his misery. This tendency to avoid responsibility and reject any form of action that challenges his intellect is not unique to the underground man. It mirrors the mindset of many individuals in the modern world, like nihilists who use their beliefs as an excuse to remain passive, to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives, and to reject engagement with the complexities of the world. By convincing themselves that their intellectual or philosophical stance is the only valid one, they refuse to act, making them prisoners of their own minds. This, in turn, leads to a profound sense of emptiness, as avoiding responsibility and rejecting action only deepens their isolation and despair, much like the underground man's eventual self-destruction.